Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and this lesson is going to be continuation of a previous one, beginning in Luke's 18th chapter. We made it all the way up to the 9th verse in the previous lesson, but we're actually going to begin at the 9th verse for this one, because as we qualified in the previous discourse, the 18th chapter opens with two parables which are instructive to prayer, the first of which pertains to the quantity of prayer. We meet a widow who pesters an unrighteous judge who eventually accommodates her request, not because he was righteous, but because she was adamant and persistent in her request. So the analogy being that we are to be consistent in our prayer with the Father, and his delays are not necessarily denials, so we are to keep always praying. And the second one pertains to the quality of prayer. But what I want to open up with is a definition of a parable, and one of the advantages of writing your thoughts down. Now, not every Christian is called to write a book, but I just so happen to have written one, the Who is My Neighbor, an extensive commentary on the Good Samaritan parable, and that's also unique to Luke's account, as are these two parables. And in the book, I define it as parables are instructive illustrations that use familiar imagery of incidents from nature's or everyday experience as analogous examples to illuminate new didactic truths in a more lifelike manner than is possible by explicit precept or general abstraction. Now, to various extents are parables wrapped in mystery, and this was the literary device was the method that he had come to rely on when there was mounting opposition. So earlier in his ministry, we witnessed, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, he gives straightforward, explicit precepts, whereas he came to rely on stories to conceal the true meaning. And very often he has to explain the meaning, because unaided we cannot independently arrive at the accurate interpretation or meaning of the parable. But these two parables are very much straightforward. There can be no mistake of its intent, and there's not a whole lot of mystery to them, but they are profound nonetheless. So with that being said, we're going to open with the 9th verse. And he also spoke this parable to some who relied on themselves, that they were righteous and looking down on others. This was a common endemic amongst the Pharisees, who were generally uncontested except by him at the synagogue level. Their roots can really be traced to the days of Ezra. They were the conservative or Orthodox, so the Orthodox Jews of today are descended from the Pharisees. They were mechanical in their observation of the law and ultimately added more than was necessary to the law. They took it upon themselves to write books this big just on what one could and could not do on the Sabbath. And this the fallacy of legalism is that it engenders self-righteousness. Now, one of the profoundest paradoxes of Christianity is that we have to approach from an attitude of our own nothingness in order to lay hold of everything. And we read of that, and we witness that in this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. I've already explained or given some background information on the Pharisees. Now I just want to extend the same courtesy to tax collectors, alternately known as publicans. Now, the majority of them were not good people. They were very much frowned upon in Israel because they worked at the behest of the Romans, and they made their living by swindling more than the mandatory minimum of the taxes which were due to their Roman overlords. But the Messiah consistently upsets and overturns the established order of the world. So he had the ability to see the redemptive potential in even the most lost of sinners who the whole world had given up on. And he even called one and elevated them to the rank of apostle, that being Matthew. And they were so notoriously disregarded that they were often mentioned in tandem with sinners. They were a unique category of sinners often. So as recently as Luke 15:1 and 2, we read of publicans and sinners mentioned in tandem. So we want to get that idea. Now, there were righteous Pharisees, there were good Pharisees, but they're almost universally depicted in a negative light throughout the New Testament. And this was because those who he interacted with and encountered were very much self-righteous, and they missed the meaning of the law they claimed to adhere by, and the prophecies they claimed to interpret literally. The Pharisee stood and began to pray with himself this way: Elohim, I thank you that I am not like the rest of men, swindlers, unrighteous, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. It's significant that he says that the Pharisee prayed with himself, because he wasn't praying to Elohim. He was announcing within earshot to all present. He clearly had the tax collector in mind when he singled him out for selection amongst the list of sinners and sins that he absolved himself of. We can justify ourselves by listing the things we don't do, but it's ultimately the things we do that condemn us. So we can't rest our righteousness on the fact that we don't cheat on our wives when we lie, when we're pathological liars, or vice versa. So really, we want to, no sin is greater than any other sin. Sin is sin, and it disqualifies us from the presence, but there is a way, and that way is through the atonement. And the Pharisee continues his self-righteous tirade in the 12th verse. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Now, in Matthew 6 chapter, we read that people who practice spiritual disciplines, whether it's giving alms or charity or tithing or praying or fasting, we are to do it without broadcasting it to the world. We are to do it for its own sake and not for its own sake. So it's entirely possible to do the right thing for the wrong reason. And that's something we are to avoid. We are to, virtue as its own reward. But the Pharisees had ulterior motives for their acts of righteousness. It was to attract attention and to demean and despise their fellow man, as he does here. But the tax collector, standing at a distance, would not even raise his eyes to the heavens, but was beating his breast, saying, Elohim, show favor unto me, a sinner. So this publican, incidentally, had even though his conduct or his behavior was more reprehensible than the Pharisees, perhaps, he was at least cognizant of his own sin, and he asked for mercy, which is the appropriate question for an awareness of one's sin, because we all stand in need of mercy. We're all sinners, even the born again and the reprobate all stand in need of the atonement, and none of us can stand on our own righteousness at the judgment. And he knew that the heart of every problem is the problem of the heart. So it's significant that he beat his breast, because he was aware, and he wouldn't even look up to the heavens. So he was looking down out of abject humility, where the Pharisee was looking down on his fellow man out of abject pride. And there is no pride more ugly than religious pride, and we witnessed that in the Pharisees. And it was something of a problem amongst in the New Testament era when it was written. I say to you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who is exalting himself shall be humbled, and he who is humbling himself shall be exalted. So again, we witness the paradox of exalting and humbling. We read of this in Luke 14:11 in a different context, and in Matthew, in the Savior's extensive indictment on the Pharisees in the 23rd chapter of Matthew. We read of it in the 12th verse. He says the same principle in a different context, but the principle is uniform. It's, again, the paradox I earlier mentioned. In order to lay claim or lay hold of everything, we have to approach it from an attitude of an awareness of our own nothingness, because in ourselves we are nothing special. We do not merit salvation, but through the atonement we can lay claim to the riches of heaven and heavenly exaltation. And now in the 15th verse, this transitions into an alternate juncture. The parables have concluded. There were two parables, one after the other. And here we read that, and they also brought infants to him to touch them, But his disciples, seeing it, rebuked them. Now, we don't know who the they is, but we can imagine that there was a crowd around him, and it was common practice for rabbis to bless children and to behold children, but the disciples thought that they were distractions and unimportant and unworth his time, so they were guarding what they thought to be his dignity and his burden, but there was no burden. Now, the people who stand in need of ministry rarely come to us at our own convenience, but we're not to view them as interruptions, but as opportunities. But Yahshua called to him and said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of Elohim." So here we read that spirit of childlikeness is an essential prerequisite in order to qualify for heavenly salvation. Now, this is a danger that as we spiritually mature, we can develop pharisaical traits, which we are implicitly instructed to avoid, that being self-righteousness, pride, demeaning and despising those who are perhaps not as attentive to religion and ritual as we are. But the little children, now the child is an artless, trusting believer. They don't need additional information to trust their parent. It's a natural condition, and we are to be similarly minded with our Heavenly Father in order to, so we have to this is the danger we run the risk of in spiritual maturity, is to lose sight of our infantile outlook, which we were all born again with. "Truly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of heaven as a little child shall certainly not enter into it." So once more, I said something I could have said after reading it, before I read it, but the gist is essentially unaltered, that it's an essential prerequisite for our salvation. And and then in the next, we read in the 18th verse, "And a certain ruler asked him, saying, Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit everlasting life? So Yahshua said to him, Why do you call me good? No one is good except one, Elohim." So this ruler, he may not have been aware of the incarnate presence of Elohim, yet the Messiah was implicitly alluding to it, saying that he was in fact good, but he was wondering if he had an awareness of who he was talking to in an approachment. And he says, "You know the commands: do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, respect your father and your mother." So he's reiterating. Now he's saying that if one obeyed and honored the law in perfection, that could merit their salvation. But we all invariably fall short at one point or another, and to various degrees we fall short of the exalted standards as outlined in the Ten Commandments. But he's saying that if we did, so we're saved by grace and faith, not through legalism. And this ruler was so designated as he was an authority in the local synagogue. And he said, "All these I have watched over from my youth." So he's confident in his legalistic standing according to the dictates of the Mosaic law, yet he's still asking what more he needs to do to inherit eternal life. And hearing this, Yahshua said to him, "Yet one thing you lack. Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you shall have treasure in the heavens. And come, follow me." But when he heard this, he became intensely sad, for he was extremely rich. So he thought, when he reiterated the list of the commands, there was one he didn't mention, and that was covetousness. So he was attached to the material items. He was a wealthy young ruler who seemingly had external success, but didn't have eternal assurance because he was too attached to the things of the world and the accumulations of wealth. And that was the condition he laid down for following him. So after you've done this, follow me. Now, this is not a universal application, so a lot of people think that wealthy Christians they're not necessarily commanded to do this, but they should be able to theoretically, if so asked. And when Joshua saw, he became intensely sad. He said, "How hard it is for those who have riches to enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now, riches are not a disqualifying barrier. It's not money itself, which is the root of all evil, but the love of money. We read in 1 Timothy 6:10. For it is easier for a camel to enter through a needle's eye than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of Elohim. So this was an analogy, a camel being exponentially larger than the eye of a needle. We witnessed something infinitesimally smaller than a camel. So the passage of that was analogously as difficult for one who has riches and loves them and is attached to them and prioritizes them above that which is of eternal value. So to return to Matthew 6 chapter, we read, invest your treasures in heaven where moths do not rust, where it cannot rust and moths do not eat, which are the prices we pay for worldly wealth. And those who heard it said, "And who is able to be saved?" And he said, "What is impossible with men is possible with Elohim." So the publican was seemingly disqualified from salvation from the worldly lens, yet he writes that he was justified in heaven on account of his abject humility as expressed in his prayer. So this is the impossibility of men being possible with Elohim is alluded to in Luke's account as early as verse 137. The doctrine of the virgin birth it's explained in that context, and that's another lesson entirely and something we might pick up on a future discourse. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.